All right, today we're going to be debunking Black Lives Matter. And I want to do this because I'm not trying to say that there isn't a problem. I'm just saying that we're focusing on the wrong things. And I honestly believe that there is a false narrative being pushed out there with ulterior motives. And we're going to get into that. So we're going to start here. If you go to the Black Lives Matter website, there's a section called What We Believe. Some have seen it, some haven't. So I think it's important to start here. This basically summarizes what this organization believes in. So here's something I always tell people. The statement Black Lives Matter is something I think everyone should agree with. Black lives do matter. Human beings matter. One thing I don't agree with is the organization Black Lives Matter. And they just happen to take a term that it would seem obvious you should agree with and turn it into an organization with a stated set of beliefs, which is what we see here. So there is a difference between the statement Black Lives Matter and the organization. I agree with the statement. I don't agree with the organization. So when we look at what we believe on their website, we're just going to go through it. 4 years ago, what is now known as the Black Lives Matter Global Network began to organize. It started out as a chapter-based, member-led organization whose mission was to build local power and to intervene when violence was inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. In the years since, we've committed to struggling together and to imagining and creating a world free of anti-Blackness where every Black person has the social, economic, and political power to thrive. So I don't think there's anything wrong with striving to have a world where people are viewed as equal, regardless of race and gender. There's equal opportunity. Nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with trying to get rid of stigmas and in this sense of racism. Now, how much of that is an actual problem in today's standards in the West? That's a debate. Although here it seems to be like, oh, it's just running rampant. It's everywhere. It's a huge issue. Again, that's debatable. So here it goes. Black Lives Matter began as a call to action in response to state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. Our intention from the very beginning was to connect Black people from all over the world who have a shared desire for justice to act together in their communities. The impetus for that commitment was, and still is, the rampant and deliberate violence inflicted on us by the state. So there's a lot of state talk here. So basically, this is kind of where you see a lot of the ideology of fascism come from, is because they're referencing the state and they're saying that they're being oppressed by the state and its systems, in particular law enforcement, which is a part of fascism, which is basically what's supposed to uphold all of the system together and enforce any sort of dissent, which essentially in the communistic structure, you would have the same. You would have a unit designed to deal with dissent and punish those that go against the grain, because the system cannot survive in a structure like communism without having some sort of enforcement. Now, that's a different discussion. But for now, you just look at this. The terminology that's being used here is the state. Enraged by the death of Trayvon Martin and the subsequent acquittal of his killer, George Zimmerman, and inspired by the 31-day takeover of the Florida State Capitol by Power U and the Dream Defenders, we took to the streets. A year later, we set out together on the Black Lives Matter Freedom Ride to Ferguson in search of justice for Mike Brown and all of those who have been torn apart by state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. So now there's this narrative that it's a state-led violence that's being carried out. So on behalf of the state, there's violence being carried out in a racist form towards Black people. And the two examples they give are Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown. Now, yes, Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown had their lives taken. But if you look at the case, particularly here, this is the Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin case, you can go through the investigation and you'll see that he was acquitted. So Trayvon Martin was beating the snot out of George Zimmerman, and he acted in self-defense and shot Trayvon Martin. Now, the question is, why was Zimmerman following Trayvon Martin? Well, I read through the case, and basically there was a series of break-ins that had occurred. Zimmerman thought Trayvon looked suspicious. Now, there can be a discussion to be had on, well, why is a Black person in a hoodie considered suspicious? There could be a conversation for that. He called the police. The police told him not to, follow Trayvon. And then after that, he ended up seeing Trayvon. And then they got into an altercation where Trayvon ended up beating the crap out of George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman responded by shooting him. Trayvon died. And then there was a ton of eyewitness accounts that were basically just fabricated or misleading, and a lot of stuff you read in here. And so basically, after a long, drawn-out case, he was acquitted and found to be not guilty, and on the grounds of self-defense. So in a system where you have due process and evidence and facts and medical experts involved, there's a lot that occurs. And just because the outcome isn't what you want it to be doesn't mean that there's a state-led call to violence against Black bodies. The next thing I'd like to look at is the Mike Brown situation. So I read through the Mike Brown case as well. Basically, he had left a store. They had called in that he had stolen some cigars, and then the officer responded. He was leaving the scene of another call, like a medical situation. He sees the two guys, Michael Brown and his friend, that fit the description. He basically tells them to pull over, and like they were in the middle of the street, tells them to, get off to the sidewalk so he can talk to them. And Michael Brown basically just cusses out the officer. The officer then tells him, he pulls over, gets out of the car, calls him to come over. And basically Michael Brown starts fighting the officer and starts fighting him to the point to where they end up back in the officer's car with Mike Brown attacking the officer. The officer pulls out his weapon, warns him, I will shoot you if you don't stop. He then shoots Mike Brown through the hand. Mike Brown takes off running. The officer follows, obviously. Now a major crime has been committed. And then Mike Brown turns around and attacks the officer until the officer ends up shooting Mike Brown, I believe it was 6 times in the right arm, and then twice, one in the face through the eye, and then the other shot that ended his life through the top of the skull. There were 3 autopsies that were conducted because of this situation. So 3 autopsies that occurred that all basically said he got shot through his hand fighting the officer, and then he was not shot in the back. Eyewitness testimony basically aligned with the officer's testimony and account of what occurred. And all of the autopsies and crime evidence that was found, everything at the scene aligned with the story of the officer and the eyewitness accounts. Then there was also in this case eyewitnesses that had lied and fabricated and harassed witnesses to try and change their side of the story. So when you look at the Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown situations, this due process that occurred, an entire trial occurred, and both people that Black Lives Matter is against were found to be not guilty. And of course, that to them is state-led violence against Black bodies. But I mean, it's just not like the facts are just not on the side of that narrative. They just aren't. So we continue. Basically, Ferguson helped to catalyze a movement to which we've all helped give life. Organizers who call this network home have ousted anti-Black politicians, won critical legislation to benefit Black lives, and changed the terms of the debate on Blackness around the world. Through movement and relationship building, we have also helped catalyze other movements and shifted culture with an eye toward the dangers, impacts of anti-Blackness. So this continues. Basically, it's Black Lives Matter stands for, here we go. We are unapologetically Black in our positioning and affirming that Black Lives Matter. We need not qualify our position. To love and desire freedom and justice for ourselves is a prerequisite for wanting the same for others. But in order to achieve this, they have to basically overthrow the state that they believe is against them. So the entire state and being of the nation is against Blackness, essentially. That's the narrative. And so how do you overcome that? Well, you don't change the state, you overthrow the state, and then you rebuild it. Another thing so the referring to the state, another thing is they say, we are guided by the fact that all Black lives matter, regardless of actual or perceived sexual identity, gender expression, economic status, ability, disability, religious beliefs or disbeliefs, immigration status, or location. Okay, cool. You're not against them for, however any Black person identifies themselves, be it through their faith or sexual identity, economic status, any of that. Okay, cool. We make space for transgender brothers and sisters to participate and lead. We are self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege, here we go, and uplift Black trans folk, especially Black trans women, who continue to be disproportionately impacted by trans antagonistic violence. Now, is this trans antagonistic violence a state-led thing as well? Because you don't say that here. Now the narrative's kind of shifting towards just violence for a oppressed community as you're identifying it as. But now this isn't a state-led thing, which is interesting. We build a space that affirms Black women and is free from sexism, misogyny, and environments in which men are centered. Okay, this must be a systemic thing as well. It's just not emphasized here. We practice empathy. You see a lot of that with the riots going on, right? A lot of empathy. We engage comrades. Oh boy, so you're talking about state-led violence now. Comrades with the intent to learn about and connect with their contexts. We make our spaces family-friendly and enable parents to fully participate with their children. We dismantle the patriarchal practice that requires mothers to work double shifts so that they can mother in private even as they participate in public justice work. So there's a patriarchal system, a man-led system that requires mothers to work double shifts. I don't even know where the evidence is for that. Yes, women are working, but it's from like feminist movements, got women rights to vote, eventually led to women working, which then led to rights in the workplace, which then led to now you have a whole other half of the population working, which then led to the demand of jobs being higher, therefore the supply being lower, meaning that the shift went on to the employer now having a pick of the lot, basically driving down wages. But how is that a patriarchal thing? That's my question. The result of double shifts is from people starting to work. I don't know. It's just, and to blame it on a man-led thing is just interesting. The patriarchy, you hear that, but I don't see it. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. So when you look at the nuclear family, what is a nuclear family? A nuclear family, elementary family, or a conjugal family is a family group consisting of two parents and their children, one or more. It is in contrast to a single parent family, the larger extended family, or a family with more than two parents. So in other words, a nuclear family is a family, usually man and woman, that's married, that have offspring, and they stay together as a family. So it's not a divorced family. It's not a single parent family. It's not kids living with their grandparents or aunts and uncles. It's a mother and father with their offspring. Now, they're against that for who knows why, and they believe in supporting each other as extended families in villages. They're comrades in villages against the state. I mean, if that's not blatantly communist, I don't know what it is. But aside from that, the entire narrative started from two shootings that occurred that were kind of like the final straw because of all the other shootings that have occurred in history. And that's now evidence of a state-led movement to commit violence against Black bodies. And now they're talking about basically fighting for the rights of other minorities within a Black community, which would be transgender, feminists, non-cisgender people, and living in villages, for single mothers being supported by a village people in the community because there's such a high rate of fatherless households. And that's somehow at fault of a patriarchal structure. So let me get this straight. There's a patriarchal man-led structure of white supremacists. They rule over your lives, and it's a state-led movement to commit violence against Black. This is like conspiracy theory land right now. Like there's nothing factual that's pointing to this. And I think that's the most concerning part. And then now they want to disrupt the nuclear family. So basically, they don't believe in mother, father, offspring. They want to break that up. Single parents come together. They all live together. I don't know what kind of environment that creates. Based on what I've seen, the research has shown that living in a two-parent household and you're brought up in that leads to a better life statistically. Now, there's something I wanted to point out. So if you look at the one of the founders, Patrice Colors, or Colors, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but Patrice Colors, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter, it states it very clearly here. Now, this has gone around for a while. This is an unlisted video, but it's on their website. It's been embedded in blog articles, but basically just take a listen here. So this is, out of a 10-minute video, this is the part that really stands out.
They actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories. And I think that what we really try to do is build a movement that could be utilized by many, many Black folk. We don't necessarily want to be the vanguard of this movement. I think we've tried to put out a political frame that's about centering who we think are the most vulnerable amongst the Black community to really fight for all of our lives.
So the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement are trained Marxists. So of course now all of this makes sense. They're against the state. They believe the state's against them. They said they didn't want to be the vanguard, so they don't want to be like the leaders. They just wanted to create this, basically come up with a political narrative, push it out there, get a lot of people to bite onto it, and then they can just step back and let this thing grow. Just let it grow. We have a set of stated principles. We all have these common foundations, and then just let it grow. And then as it grows and as we come into power, we'll start bringing in these structural changes all the way to the point of overthrowing the system to get rid of these things. I don't know what getting rid of a traditional nuclear family structure is going to do. I don't understand what rioting in the streets and burning down cities over what you would say is state endorsed violence over Black bodies. But let's just get into that now. So this is where the debunking part comes in. So the whole premise of the Black Lives Matter movement started from the shooting of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown, as stated here, and since has evolved into all the other things that you saw, like the dismantling the nuclear family, living in villages, supporting each other through that, queer rights, trans rights, all that stuff. But it started with the shooting of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, which we saw, or Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown, which we saw was through evidence. It's sad that they occurred and the loss of life is tragic, but these were justified shootings. So now if you look at the statistics, I see it all the time now. It's like the Black Lives Matter movement. It's always saying, the left is always saying Black people are being murdered every day in the streets, left and right, all the time. Well, look at the graph here. So if you look at the number of people shot to death by police in the United States from 2017 to 2020 by race, obviously white people are shot the most, blacks are second, Hispanic, other, unknown. So people argue, oh, well, of course white people are shot more because there's more white people in America. Okay, that's a fair point. But let's break it down from there. There's more to it than that. So the next thing I wanted to look at was, before we even get into that, just think of it like this. There's 52 weeks in a year, okay? On average, let's just take the Black population of police encounters that result in fatal shootings. On average, there's around 222 Black people fatally shot by police officers per year, okay? That's enough to basically have 4 news stories per week for an entire year. So that means every week they could be pushing a new case, a new shooting that occurred, and make it seem like it's a much larger statistic than it actually is. Because it's actually an outlier. It's a statistical anomaly. It is such a tiny percentage chance that your encounter with law enforcement will result in you dying. But because the media is able to pump out a story a week or multiple stories per week if they wanted to, they can manipulate the public into thinking this is a much larger issue than it actually is. So we move on. So you start looking at, okay, well, what's the statistics of the United States population? Well, the population, according to 2019, was 328 million people. Okay. Out of that, people under 5, 6%. So you got to remember too, you can't look at just all of the percentage from 328 million, because not all of them are even in an age range that'll be committing murders or dealing with law enforcement, right? Like a baby is not going to, but a baby falls into that statistic. So honestly, when you look at the murder victims, people usually fall, I think it was between 15 and 39 years old. But for the later breakdowns, we're going to look at just the whole population. But keep that in mind. You're going to look at white percentage, 76% of the country, and then Black or African American alone, 13.4%. And then of all the studies, around 50% are male, 50% are female. So now how many law enforcement are there? Well, in 2018, there was 686,000. I think this averaged out to something like 74,000 officers active at any given year from 2004. That's what it averaged out to. Now, these stats are important. So you look at the FBI stats, okay? So out of murder, how many murders are committed per year? And this year that it was taken, the total was 9,468. And out of that, those were committed, 44.2% were committed by whites, and 53.1% were committed by Black Americans. So these statistics are important. This number is actually much higher when you look at on average, it's 6 per 100,000 murders occur in the United States annually, which is close to 20,000. It's around 19,000 something. So keep that in mind. 44% are a result of white Americans committing the murder, and 53.1% are the result of black Americans committing the murder. So now you have to break down out of the murder, how many are men, how many are female? Well, 88.7%, so the vast majority of people that commit murder are male, and 11.3% are female. So we'll keep that in mind as well later on. So now you look at, well, what kind of crimes are committed? So there was over 240 million calls to law enforcement annually that occur. 240 million calls to law enforcement. And out of that, there is a total of 1.2 million violent crimes that are committed that results. So these are the crimes. And then also, if you combine the larceny, theft, burglary, and violent crime, this is over 7 million. Because someone that's committing theft or burglarizing may not be doing something violent, but that could also result in an altercation that results in a fatal shooting. Like Mike Brown, for instance. This was a burglary call that resulted in Mike Brown trying to beat up the officer and then dying as a result in self-defense. So now we go to the numbers. Okay, so let's break this down. This is where the debunking really happens. So the US population is 328 million. The population by race, there's 76.3% white, 13.4% black. The population between 15 to 39 years old is 56 million male, 54 million female. We're not actually going to really get into this beyond that. I just wanted this to be here so you can actually think about it, because again, we're going to compare it by the entire population when really there are portions of the population that are, under a certain age and over a certain age that's really old, that are chances are those people in those demographics are not committing these crimes. So murder committed by gender. So 88% we saw was male and 11.3% is female. Murder by race, we saw that whites commit 44.2%, black Americans commit 43.1%. So annual murders, there was according to the CDC, I saw 6 per 100,000 murders, and out of that 4.5 per 100,000 were firearms, but we're just going to go with the overall murder rate. So average, there's about 50 officers per year that lose their lives in duty as they're performing as law enforcement. So now we're going to break it down. So murders by gender. So male, you take the 88.7%, you multiply that by the overall, and you have 17,469 murders are committed by male and 2,225 committed by female. So now you break it down by race and gender. So out of that, white population, 76.3%. So white males committed 7,721 murders, while females commit on average 983. So you look at the black population, which represents 13.4%. You divide that also by 50% for male and female. You have black males committed 9,276 murders. Black females committed 1,181. So now you look at the murder representation by race. So white representation, you have 3.5 murders committed per 100,000 people in the population. And black representation is 23.8 per 100,000 in the population. So the murder representation by gender and race. So when you look at the white population, 3.5 whites kill whites within 100,000. And in the black representation, you have 23.8 per 100,000 in the black population. So the murder representation by gender and race. So white males are 6 out of 100,000, which is like directly in line with the CDC. White female representation is 0.8 per 100,000. Black male representation is 44, 7 times more per 100,000. So 6.7% of the population commits 7 times more murder than 38% of the population in terms of the demographics for males committing murder. Black females are 5.3 per 100,000, nearly 7 times that of their counterparts, the white females. So black males are 7 times more likely to commit murder than white males. Black females are 6.7 times more likely to commit murder than white females. So now you look at the officers, okay? So the officer average, there's 674,000 officers per year that are active. Officers murdered is 50. So there's 7.42 officers that die per 100,000 annually. Officer involved shootings, annual average, there's around 996 shootings that occur per year. So out of 365 days a year, there's more than one that occurs throughout the year in any given day. Think about that. More than one a day that occurs. So there's enough. If you really wanted to draw this narrative of police brutality, you could theoretically in the media do this and manipulate the minds of people to think that this is a massive, massive issue when it's 996 people that are shot by law enforcement on average out of 240 million calls. 240 million calls to law enforcement, 996 result in fatal shootings. It's a statistical anomaly. Shooting representation by officers, 148 per 100,000. So 140 officers per 100,000 officers are involved in a fatal shooting, which seems like an astronomically high number when you compare it to the rest of all this other stuff that we saw. But you got to remember, they're the ones dealing with the crime. They're the ones interacting with the criminals. They're the ones defending themselves when a criminal starts fighting them, pulls a gun on them, charges them with a knife, whatever it is. Annual calls to law enforcement, 240 million. So when you take the calls to law enforcement and connect that to the shooting representation per calls, it's 0.4 per 100,000. So this 148 dwindles down to nothing when you actually take into account the amount of times law enforcement is called upon and how often that results in a fatal shooting. Point 4. It's a statistical anomaly. Annual crimes committed, 7.6 million. Annual violent crimes, 1.2 million. When you compare that, representation officer shootings to crimes committed, 13 per 100,000 and 82 per 100,000 for violent crimes. So even though over 1 million violent crimes are committed that involve law enforcement, only 82 shootings occur per 100,000. Officer shootings with total population by race, on average, there are 409 white population shot per year. That's 0.16 per 100,000. And this is where people say, oh, well, the black population is a much smaller statistic in terms of the population. So on average, there's 222 black people shot per year, which equals 0.5 per 100,000. That's roughly 3 times more. So it's 3 times more likely for a black person statistically to be shot by a police officer than a white person. But then you do the math, and you look at the numbers, and its black population is 7 times more likely to commit murder and 3 times more likely to get shot by police than the white population. So even though they're 7 times more likely to commit murder, they're only 3 times. So it's disproportionate in the amount of times. So they're more likely to commit the crime statistically, but they're not as likely as the crime they commit to be counted as a statistic to be shot by law enforcement, even though it is 3 times higher. Murders committed compared to officer involved shootings. White, 8,704 murders committed, male and female, 409 officer involved shootings. So whites commit 8,700 murders and get shot 409 times as a result. And this is where it leads to. Black population commits 10,457 murders, and that results in 222 officer involved shootings. So if you look at this all, the black and white, regardless, there's too much. There's too much murder. And even with all that murder, there's still a significantly less amount of those people being shot by law enforcement. The white population is 20 times more likely to be shot by another white person than by law enforcement, and the black population is 45 times more likely to be shot by another black person than by law enforcement. That's where I wanted to lead this to. The narrative right now is that the police are the issue, not the crime, not whatever is leading these people to commit these atrocious acts on another human being. What is causing these people to commit murder? There's a lot of debate to be had there. I would go down the road of poverty. There's a lot we can discuss on that. But right now, I wanted just to point out that the issue here is not law enforcement shooting people. Yet that's what you're being told. You're being told that Black Lives Matter is a necessary movement because the state-led regime is out there to murder black people en masse in the streets, which is just not happening. It's not occurring. It's a statistical anomaly. It's an outlier. There's people that commit crimes and they result in fighting law enforcement or brandishing weapons or firing at them or attacking them, and it results in a shooting and a tragic loss of life. And that's something that we need to consider. When you look at the likelihood of being murdered, this is your chance of being a victim. Black people are overwhelmingly represented as likelihood of being a victim. And this is not being a victim at the hands of a police officer. This is what we need to focus on. We need to focus on all crime being committed and what leads communities of any race to commit murder, to rob, to commit crimes in general. That's the real issue. That's what needs to be focused on. If you look at this graph, this is violent crime from 1990 to 2018. It's drastically gone down. So even with everything that I'm showing you, the crime rate, violent crime has gone down significantly in the last few decades. It's gone down. So crime's gone down. Police-involved shootings is a statistical anomaly and it's not likely to happen. Yet we're hearing all the time that black people are being murdered en masse in the streets, being hunted down and murdered by cops, which is not the case. It's not true. It just is not true. And there's entire movements now and uprisings occurring trying to overthrow the country and rebuild it based off a false premise. And that's something that is very serious and needs to be considered. Now, the last thing I wanted to leave off with is something that I found to be extremely interesting because a lot of people say, oh, well, why couldn't you use a different method? Why did you have to shoot the perpetrator? Why did you have to shoot and kill this person? Well, the law enforcement puts their lives on the line to protect us, and they deal with the worst of the worst. And a lot of the time, those people are willing to do things that the average person is not even thinking of doing, like shooting a police officer. That's just not something most people do. That's not normal, right? But they deal with people that are willing to do that, and they need to defend themselves because it's either them going home or them thinking, oh, this person might be a nice human being, and then them dying and their family now loses a loved one at the hands of a criminal that doesn't care. I found this on TikTok. I thought it was very interesting, and I just want to leave off with this. This firearms trainer is basically showing you how fast it is for someone to pull out a weapon and fire it at an officer, and why reaction time matters, and how if you are not complying or showing your hands or you're reaching for something, this is how fast everything could change if the officer does not react, which results in them losing their lives.
You be able to respond? You think you might be able to?
Possibly.
Yes. Y'all start giving me commands. Put your hands up. Y'all tell me, do you see my hands? So you don't know what I have in front, do you? No. I mean, I shit.
And there it is. It's just that easy. It's that fast. Seconds, milliseconds. And to think that they're putting their lives on the line and these things happen. It's unfortunate. But crime is down and the narrative is false. It's a false premise. It's not something that is real. It's been proven statistically. It's just not the case. And I want you to remember that. I think that's extremely important. So anytime you hear all this nonsense, just remember this, that there's data out there, factual evidence to disprove all of these narratives. And I think that is the direction we need to go. Because there are conversations to be had about training, about poverty, about why crime is committed, how to solve those problems. But right now we're fighting a ghost. We're fighting something fake that's not real, that doesn't exist. A false narrative about Black people being murdered and targeted by law enforcement. It's just not true. This isn't. Hope you guys are all staying safe out there. I know everything's nuts. Cities burning down, all of this conspiracy talk getting thrown out there and people eating it up. But I believe things will get better. Stay safe out there and God bless. Until next time.